Wow, full house. Thanks, Carol. Full house here, and I know there's a lot more in the arena. This is wonderful. I feel like I'm with my friends today because, you know, I've been here at K-State now about 23 years and have just immensely enjoyed the opportunity to interact and engage with you guys, and appreciate really, truly, from the bottom of my heart, the support you guys give K-State, and it's wonderful to see former and present students in here. You guys are future leaders, and I'm excited about this industry when I see the young folks that are here at K-State, the kinds of things they're doing and the kinds of opportunities they're going to have as they look forward. I was asked to come in and spend some time with you forecasting, talking about the forecasts over the next 40 years or so. I typically can't forecast next week. I even asked my wife the next day. She can't even figure out what I'm doing because I don't know. So 50 years out, 40 years out, it's a pretty interesting challenge. But I'll make an attempt here to give you at least some perspective of some of the things that are happening globally especially, and what it means for ultimately Kansas beef industry is ultimately where I want to take this discussion. And you know, the whole impetus of why we even start this dialogue about looking forward and saying, what do the patterns in the world and the demographics and the population dynamics, what do they imply about us in agriculture who feed these people, whose job it is to produce and prepare and have available a food supply that has safe attributes, is nutritious, affordable, and all the things that go into the necessities of the human population. We have a very big, important role because food is obviously a very important resource for us. It's absolutely essential. Over the next 40 years, we're expecting about a 35% increase in population. Go back to the mid-'80s, by 2050, we expect population to be about double what it was just 15 years ago or so. That's an amazing statistic to me, to think about just a few years ago and 40 years from now having double the amount of mouths in the world to feed. That's a phenomenal kind of growth. Now, that's what brings us to the table, is say, look at the kind of projection here we have in terms of population growth estimates. And I'm going to drill down a little bit more at this and look at a little bit more detail at some specific countries and look a little at what this might mean. But I want to step back just for a moment and put our minds in a certain perspective. And the whole science of economics, any Economics 1 textbook you pick up today will tell you that economics is the allocation of scarce resources among competing demands. Scarce resources. Resources that are near and dear and limited. And all of our resources are in some way limited. They constrain us from being able to do something we might want to do. And I know myself, my most scarce resource is time. I am constantly trying to figure out how I can squeeze more things into the same time period before. But scarce resources are pervasive throughout our entire agricultural and resource base. Scarce resources. And of course, when something's scarce, the thing that allocates it ultimately is price. But when something's scarce and it's near and dear, there's going to be competition for it. And if you look over history, nearly every war that's ever been fought has been either some combination of political, social, and/or fighting over scarce resources. So not only is this scarce resource thing kind of an interesting thing just to watch and see how markets operate and where markets ultimately settle and who produces what at what price and who gets to make money doing that, the allocation of those resources has had enormous impacts on our world security and just overall human interaction. And so it's a hugely important attribute. And I'll even show you some more recent stuff that will help us remember just how important that is. A little bit more on the history lesson, and then I'll start looking forward again. The whole reason we start thinking about this comes back ultimately to this guy, Malthus. And Malthus basically said, look, resources are limited and scarce. Oh, and by the way, at some point, you will exhaust those resources. You will use them to their fullest extent. And once you use them to their fullest extent, and your population continues to grow, biologically it grows exponentially according to the population growth theories. Population grows exponentially, you will exhaust the resource base, and at some point, the allocation of those resources will take place through misery and vice. We'll kill each other for those resources. That's how important they will be to us. Now, you'll also see Malthus cited in every Economics 1 textbook. And in a picture sort of way, he says, look, population grows exponentially. At some point, you use those resources, and at some point, you get diminishing returns to additional inputs. And at this point, beyond this point, when population continues to grow and you've exhausted your resource base, you will have misery and vice from there forward. And you will fight for the resources and for the food and for everything else. Well, the textbooks then, they dismiss a lot of times, they debunk Malthus by saying, well, Malthus, look, you didn't realize that there would be technology that would actually make the production opportunity shift up over time. Actually, Malthus wasn't dumb. He knew there was technology. He knew all about that. He just didn't think that technology could expand fast enough. And in many of his, he was more theological about it really in many ways, but in many of his dialogues, that's what he was mentioning, that look, you will have technology growth, but it can't expand as rapidly as that exponential population curve. Well, it's held up pretty well so far. But my main message is, and it's the bottom line, and it's what I'll end my talk on as well, is that we do need that technology, or we will have misery and vice. So the technology is absolutely critical to the entire projection into 2050 of how we're going to get there and what we're going to look like getting to that journey is through technology and how it helps us. Take just a little example with corn yields because it's a very easy one to illustrate the magnitude of technology and the impact it's had on our society already just in the last few years. Here's the graph, long-term graph, 1900 to 2009, US corn yield. And you can see, of course, that as we started to develop hybridization there in the 60s and 70s and 80s and ultimately got into genetic engineering and everything else, the yields have taken off. They have just gone very, very accelerated increases. And as we hear and read the new technology on the forefront, this curve is going to even take off and continue to take off at a very rapid rate. Almost exponential growth in many ways in corn yield. That's a phenomenal story. But that's technology. That's what does that. It's new discoveries. It's our new young scientists who are developing their skills and developing the new varieties and developing the technology that will get us to the next level. Let me just give you an example of what happens if you don't embrace and adopt and develop technology. Here's drilling down a little closer to the Iowa corn yield from 1994 to 2009, last 15 years or so. And you can see we've had what used to probably be typical expected yield 10 years ago around 150 bushels. Today, when you plant corn in Iowa, you're expecting about 170 to 180 bushels. Just over that short time period, you now have about a 30 bushel expected higher yield than you would have had just a few years ago. Well, Italy is one of the EU's larger corn producing regions. And Italy used to, in the early 90s and into the mid 90s, have yields that were typically 10 bushels or so, typically, higher than Iowa. They typically out-yielded Iowa. They had better quality lands and/or better weather, and they typically out-yielded Iowa. Look what's happened since 2000. How did this happen? How did Iowa continue this spiral upward and Italy just kind of muddle along and ultimately have a very large yield gap relative to Iowa? Well, here's how it happened. The Iowa producer adopted genetic engineered varieties. The yield gap started to increase there in 2002, when about 40% of the corn in Iowa was genetically engineered, and by 2009, we're at 50 bushel yield differential between Iowa and Italy. And Italy, and Europe in general, has resisted adoption of genetically engineered grain and seed varieties. Spain is probably the leader in Europe, but very, very low adoption rates there. The bottom curve can't feed the world without misery and strife. The upper curve can help. Think about what corn price would be this year had we not adopted genetic engineering. And we'd have had, I don't think the entire 50 is genetic engineering, because Italy had also a bit of a down year, you can see, but maybe 30 of it is. I don't know, we could debate it. But think about if we'd have had a 30 bushel lower yield. Think what corn price would be right now. I can tell you it'd make 2008's corn price look like a pretty good bargain if we had nationally a 30 bushel lower yield. So technology is huge here. I mean, it will drive how much misery or how much prosperity and how happy and how well fed and how healthy consumers are. It will drive that. And so I think it's we can't overemphasize how much impact and importance, what did I do here? How much impact and importance that'll have in our future. Looks like I got that thing stuck somewhere. So how do you develop technology? Well, you invest in people, and you invest in science, and you invest in discovery, and you invest in laboratories, and you invest in equipment. And yet, what worries me some is when I look at what our public investment trend has been for scientific discovery. We are at least in the US, de-investing. We are reducing that investment. That concerns me. 25% drop from 2003 to 2009 in USDA public funding. Now, I'll show you here next a quick fact. I'll go to it and come back. This is total research and development, and all I want to point out is this middle blue here is private research and development, and private research and development is growing immensely. Okay, so there is growth in private, which is a good thing. It's saying, the companies that are having the profit opportunities are investing huge. And there is obviously a lot of development going on there. But let me tell you why this one worries me for the private as well. Where do the private people get their trained scientists? They get them at the land-grant universities and the other scientific community universities around the world, really. But certainly, the folks that are doing the science at the universities are training those scientists for the private industry. If we reduce and continue to decline the funding support from the public level, we will lose some of our comparative advantage for sure. Because the private sector, where are they going to go to get those scientists to continue that kind of growth in private research and development? So these are very closely interlinked. And the public sector helps fuel, without a doubt, helps fuel the talent for the private sector to develop the technology. Technology is it's the whole story of my entire talk here today, is the technology opportunities. Well, let me come back to this population thing a little bit, and I'm going to bring this back to beef here in a second, talk a little about what it means for us. Something interesting about this population picture. In 1989, the world went from increasing population at an increasing rate to increasing population at a decreasing rate. And you can't see it very well in this graph, but let me show you what I'm talking about. In 1989, we were at about 86 million people per year being added to our population. That's the growth rate, the number of new people being born that year. And look at what the trend is. we are reducing our rate of growth. Now, we're not reducing population. Remember population, going to 9+ billion people. But we're reducing the rate of growth. Now, that's pretty interesting to me. When you see countries like China who put in very strict rules and regulations on one family, one child, China's population growth policy is depopulation. That's interesting to me. That's something that Malthus would have predicted we should do. And it appears that for whatever reasons, we are, as a society, embracing that somewhat. So, interesting component here is that despite the fact population is growing very rapidly and going to continue to grow rapidly, the rate of growth has slowed and has declined back to levels that it was prior. Pretty interesting, and especially when you start making policies about what rate your population is allowed to grow. Wow, that's pretty interesting to me. That says something about the concern over scarce resources and what the population might do should resources become as scarce as some might be concerned they will. I want to drill a little bit more down to countries because that's part of the interesting story as well. I mentioned China. Look at China. They and India together today are about 40% of the world's population. A huge population base in those two countries. And because of China's policies, they actually will have depopulation if they continue at the rate that it appears they will. From 2010 to 2050, they will reduce their population base. India will become the largest country in the world in just a few years, and certainly will surpass China by a long, long ways. But there's some other interesting developments in this story of where growth is taking place. I've got the top 20, the largest 20 in 2010, and then I've got a couple other countries added there how did I go backwards? Yeah, I don't know how I do that, but there we go. I've highlighted specific countries here because what's really interesting as well about population dynamics and where population growth is occurring, these countries, all part of Africa, and Africa is realizing the fastest population growth of any continent in the world to where they, as a continent, will surpass India in population in just a few years at the growth rate. Yet if you look at Africa in general, especially sub-Saharan Africa, that's a very low income area. Now there's certainly land base yet that can be developed there, but it's a low income area, and this population growth rate, I think, is a pretty substantial challenge for maintaining some peace and maintaining diets in that region. We have seen substantial food price increases in the last few years. And this is part of what I think starts to create some of the misery, potentially, that Malthus was referring to. And the dark blue line is overall world food price, according to FAO. And there's some other individual items in there, and you can see. But what we in particular had was almost a doubling of food prices from 2003 to 2008. Almost a doubling. Now think about this. In the US, where we spend a very small percentage, generally the number would say less than 10% of our income on food per year, we see it, we felt it. I think we all noticed when we went to the grocery store, we were paying more for food. You noticed that. Well, in fact, you paid close to double according to world numbers on these selected items. But think about it in a country where 60% of your income is being spent on food and suddenly food prices increase at that rate. You can't even afford staples anymore. Staple food products become luxury items. That kind of food price increase is what starts to, I think, then create these kinds of events in the world. Protests erupted throughout the world over the last few years, all surrounding around food price increases, ultimately, and the inability of poor countries especially to be able to afford the kinds of diets that they need in order to have healthy and sustainable lives. So this has already happened in some sense, that we've had, considerable social conflict because of food challenges and getting food to the right place at the right time at a price that's affordable for those people that are in poor countries and trying to figure out how to feed a family. So clearly the unrest is there, and we've seen it, and it will continue. Food prices have declined a little bit since 2008, but we're still about 70% higher than we were in 2003, global food prices in general. The only way you can get those prices back down is technology, ultimately. Technology to develop more food, produce more food. Well, let me look now a little bit for the last few minutes, and then we'll go to some questions about the other side of this equation, and that is that while we have some of these events occurring and while we have growing population, fortunately, we also are having global income growth. How do you do that? Well, you do it through better education, you do it through industrialization, you do it through taking people who had low skills, educating them and providing them better skills so they can produce, be more productive, be more efficient. It ultimately raises their incomes. And what I want to point out here is what's particularly interesting. You look at China, Vietnam, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. These countries were all back there before and they're very heavily populated, and most of them growing. China still very heavily populated, maybe not growing so much in population. But these countries also enjoying significant GDP growth. Wow. That ought to be interesting to every single person in this room that ever has set foot on a cattle farm. Because with income will come increased demand for our product. Now, how do I know that? Well, let me just give you an example here. These diamonds represent, on the vertical axis, per capita beef consumption by country, and the horizontal axis is average income in that country. And the green line is actually a statistical fit to those data that illustrates that as you have income acceleration and growth, you increase beef consumption per person. You increase, ultimately, demand for beef as you grow in income. Now, you've got the couple of South American countries that are outliers. Low income, yet consume a lot of beef. If we could just have more of those, we'd also be pretty prosperous. You'd have even newer and bigger pickups out there in the parking lot than you do now. But notice those countries I mentioned earlier, the high income growth countries, they're still quite low income. China, Iran, Pakistan, India, Vietnam, Philippines, South Africa down there. Those are the countries with growing population base. Their income is growing. Guess what they're ready for? They're ready to start taking off as income continues to grow and become beef consumers. Their preferences are to move to meat protein bases from other food sources, and people prefer in general meat protein sources. That's some good news. You know, and one thing about this, you could probably actually put in several curves in here, because it might be that some of the Asian countries culturally, for whatever reason, will have a different growth curve, preferences, whatever else it is. Maybe some of the other countries would have other growth curves, depending on the culture, depending on the even things such as religious activities and issues with what they do and don't eat. So the growth rates won't necessarily match the green line, but I do know the direction. As we always say, I do know the sign and the direction that it's going to go. Population's growing, income's growing, and together those are good news to the beef industry. Let me give you just a really quick, I'm going to float here through several graphs. They all look similar, but they're different countries over time. This is the world's trend over the last 30 years. Whoops, I didn't mean to go to this. How do I keep doing this? The world's trends in total consumption of chicken, beef, and pork. Now, chicken and pork have grown more rapidly, as you can see, considerably more rapidly than the beef industry has. That's not actually unexpected if you look and think about what happens in the protein complex as societies grow in income. First, they shift from grain-based type, bean-based type, those kinds of proteins into the cheapest meat protein source. So typically what our research says is typically, now there's differences across cultures, but typically they first adopt chicken, poultry products, lamb in some cases, depending on the country, but chicken comes early. As income continues to grow, the next preferred is pork. And so pork starts to become a luxury item that they start to purchase more and more, and ultimately when they get to high income levels, as you saw in the previous graph, countries like the US and New Zealand and parts of Europe, beef becomes the preferred protein of those sources. So it's not unexpected that these others would have grown quicker in the last several years as income started to grow. I expect beef will have some future growth rates that should look a little better maybe than they are here. I don't know what rate. I think a little better. But still, growing nonetheless, growing in terms of total world consumption. Now, I'm going to just buzz through around the world real quick, just give you a perspective that indeed, as you look at different parts of the world, these relative shifts do look different for a variety of reasons. And so, not going to spend much time on these, but here's North America. Yeah, we've had considerable growth in North America in chicken consumption. We all know that. Pork and beef have been much more stable. South America, interesting. Chicken is very rapidly catching beef as a total consumed protein. Sub-Saharan Africa, interesting. Look, beef is actually starting to get some action. And as income growth continues there, it will continue to have some growth opportunities. The Middle East, East Asia, that's really basically China. I mean, that's the base of this population here, and that's China's pork consumption. And so you get a sense, though, that there is some upward pattern in all those commodities, some at different rates. Final comment, and then I'll open to questions. If all this opportunity is there, who's going to be at the table? Who's going to be the one producing this? And I think you already probably get a sense that whoever is best able to meet the needs of those consumers and adopt the technology and become the world supplier will be the ones that have the biggest opportunities. And right now, the US industry is challenged in many ways. We have had a long-term, pretty stagnant industry as far as growth opportunities, and that's not going to change, I don't think, for a while. And Brazil, on the other hand, has sort of been screaming. I mean, they've been going rapid. And we expected, Brazil maybe would even pass the US as the world's largest beef producer in the next several years. Now, they did have a slowdown here in 08, 09, back a little bit. But I've shown this slide here before, and I just want to put it up again one more time and just remind ourselves, look, our competition out there, in Brazil in particular, they are well poised to be a very aggressive, assertive, efficient world leader in beef production. They are young. This Rodrigo here, about 32 years old, managing about a 7,000 acre here, very intensively rotation crop and pasture grazing operation. He's multilingual, I'm not even single-lingual. He's very well educated, and he was common all over the industry there when we were there a couple of years ago. He's energetic, he's confident, and he knows what it takes to adopt the next technology. Brazil has had phenomenal technology adoption in pasture, grazing, and rotations to the point where it's phenomenal growth kinds of opportunities, which is why their industry has grown so rapidly, and they still have lots of opportunity there. It's not cutting the rainforest that's made them grow so rapidly. It's intensive adoption of better technologies for animal production. Okay, and of course, the world's current market shares on exports to the world, U.S. being third, we used to be second. Of course, we're still trying to recover from our BSE loss of markets. So what's it all mean? Growing population, I think that's pretty well established, and I don't think there's a lot of debate about it. 35% growth is the projection. We can debate about the rates. It has declined in terms of its rate of growth, or it would be even greater than that. But nonetheless, population's expanding rapidly and going to continue to do so. Food prices have been considerably higher in recent years than they were just a few years ago. That's created some unrest. That's created some social conflict. I don't see food prices going down very soon in the world. Input costs continue to escalate, and we're challenged to provide food. Now, we may not see the 2008 levels because there was a combination of a lot of things that created that. We may not see that same level, or hopefully not as often, those kinds of increases, but I think we will have higher levels than we used to be accustomed to. That is going to create allocation of scarce resources among competing uses. And my main message, if we're going to feed this world, we better first discover, second develop, and third adopt technology. And if we don't, you know what? Brazil will, and we'll be a very small player in the beef industry in the world. Income growth worldwide is there. It's waiting for us. It's happening. We have an opportunity as an industry to be part of that, to enjoy part of that growth. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but we better be ready and prepared as it does happen and continue to develop the technologies that will allow us to be a global supplier in a very competitive and very global industry in general. And so who's going to produce this? Well, whoever has the comparative advantage to do it. And that comes from investment in people, investment in technologies, and investment in making your industry better able to be the supplier. With that, I'll open to any questions, comments, somebody wants to disagree, or anything else. I always like the student that, you know, tells me I'm wrong, the loudest. So, questions, yes?
I'd like to get your comments on, these last couple, 3 slides about exports and those things with regard to food safety, hormone-free, those things. It seems like these are parameters, and the European market are very sensitive to things sometimes that we aren't. What do you see there as far as the future for what we're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. We have a huge need for education of consumers, a huge need to help them understand what technology offers them. And as an industry, as an agricultural industry in general, I think we've failed to be able to do that very effectively. And I'll look in the mirror and say, I'm just as guilty as anybody else at that. In other words, we develop this wonderful technology, and we see what it can do to growth and yields and growth and efficiency. And we've got lots and lots of technology, right? This whole college is based on developing technologies for our industries. We've got these wonderful technologies that can deliver all kinds of fabulous things. And what's coming down the forefront of the beef industry with gene mapping and these kind of things, it's a whole nother realm of really tremendously interesting and useful and valuable technologies. And we developed those so rapidly, but we didn't realize that there's actually a group of people that have a fear about those. And in fact, you see in the US, you see divergence of camps almost, that some who actually want to curtail and stop technology development, and the others trying to understand what are the consequences of that? I think I know the consequences if you stop technology development. right? I mean, at some point, you don't have food to feed the world. Or if you have it, it's going to be at a much higher price. So, okay, it's a long-winded answer, but the point is, we need the technology. We can't stop. And we can't stop the technology discovery just because somebody thinks that it might be a problem. What we really need to do is help them understand why it's a problem if you stop it. And it's a huge problem. And you can't feed the world with Italy's refusal to adopt genetic engineered crops. You can't feed the world with that. You can at a very, very high price and fewer people with fewer spoons. But you can't feed the world with that. And I think that the challenge there, I think, truly is so many of these technologies that are on the wave and coming really have tremendous opportunity to influence the safety of the food, which you mentioned, have tremendous influence on the nutritional aspects of the food. So it's not just getting more pounds per pound of feed or more bushels per acre, but it's also moving increasingly toward modifying and controlling how that animal or that crop responds to stimulus and what it ultimately produces, and what ultimately it gives you as a product. And you know, the good example, Monsanto says right now, they've got corn for ethanol production and corn for feed. They have different properties. Yeah, absolutely, makes a lot of sense. And so, I don't know that you're ever going to convince some people that technology and what it offers is actually in their best interest, because I think that's just going to take a huge effort at education. And I ultimately think we've spent too much time, not helping them understand, helping people understand in general what the technology is going to offer. And when I think they start to realize that more and more, they will become more accepting, that or pay higher food prices. I mean, that's their trade-off, which some are willing to do that. That's about the best I can do on that. It's a complex question. But any other comments, questions? Yes?
You mentioned the population of 2050. At some point, I've heard that it is going to increase at a decreasing rate and then balance or level off. You know when, what number that will be?
Okay, the question is, at some point, we'll mount this projection that the population will actually stop increasing and actually either stabilize or decline. Do I know when that's going to be? I think it's going to be 2064. Next question. I mean, you saw already the growth rates decline, and the forecast is going to decline even more rapidly. What's your best projection? My best is continue extrapolating that thing linearly until it gets down there. But I don't know. You know what will happen is if food prices continue to escalate, countries like China other countries will adopt similar policies out of fear for what talk about, telling of people how many kids they can have and controlling that. That's scary for people like us in the U.S. And people, in China, that's the policy. I mean, how do you control population? You do it that way, or you just voluntarily, choose to have smaller families. Resource constraints will constrain your family size at some point. Otherwise, the rest of us end up supporting that. You have to socially support that family, right? Which is an expensive endeavor. Last question.
One more question.
We had one last.
Population's going up because you aren't dying as fast, basically. So it's getting older. So what are the implications of the? Is that a U.S. phenomenon, primarily older, or Northern European U.S. or in South Africa they're dying faster? Maybe I don't know. What's the implication of the older population?
Yeah, the question is, what's the implication of aging population? Because we are, through better nutritional and better health care throughout the world, increasing our age on average and having an aging population. A lot of implications, obviously. One is, older populations have a different demand structure, for sure. They need different things. typically have a different productivity, a different, role, I guess, they play in many ways in that society as a whole. I don't know exactly. I mean, there's so many components to that. Certainly, older people have a different diet as well, and so it has some implications, no doubt. I haven't thought a lot about what that would mean. The first thing that you'll see, though, is some of this population growth certainly is out of reduced mortality rates, too. It's, in other words, out of better infant care, so a lot of the growth is occurring there as well. So you've got sort of both happening. So I don't know how populations will age very, very slowly. You and I age pretty quickly, but as a population dynamic, it ages slowly. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate your attention, sir.